instructions, as well as indicated, the instructions to Adam and me were to provide a 10-minute introduction about where and why we blog and what got us into it, why we blog particularly about the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and whether blogging should be considered activism or journalism or both. Now, I'm not particularly comfortable about talking about myself, and I can see a little reason why others should be interested, but orders are orders, so I will briefly comply before we can move on to the actual issues, and I'll raise some of the issues in the course of this. I began blogging last December. Being an academic, I could only come up with a pedestrian name for the blog, which is the U.S. and Israel, and which can be found at, predictably, JeromeSlater.com. Now, there were then, and even more so now, a growing number of excellent blogs that deal with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as well as with U.S. policies towards Israel. Especially, I may say, Mando Weiss, and when the mood strikes him, which is often, Steve Walt. So it may well be asked, I ask myself, what purpose a new one would have. Well, my hope was that as an academic who'd been teaching and writing about this matter, mostly for professional journals and professional political scientists and historians, my hope was that I could provide a historical perspective that would complement both activism and journalism. In particular, I think that there is a gap, and it's an unnecessary gap, between shorter daily comments that quickly react to recent events and long articles written for professional journals. So my hope is to help bridge this gap by writing shorter essays, principally in the 4,000 to 5,000 word range, in which I, based on research and scholarship, not mine or others, but aimed at general audiences, not written in academic prose, and reasonably closely tied to current events, instead of things which are going to appear 2 years later, if at all, in a professional journal which is only going to be read by a handful of professionals interested in the topic. Just as one example, a couple months after the publication of the Goldstone report, I wrote 2 fairly long analyses of it on my blog. Now, aside from that, in addition, from time to time, when some especially outrageous event occurs, I mean, outrageous events in this topic are daily, but one particularly outrageous one appears, or there's some particularly noxious right-wing article is published, or there's a typically misleading and half-truthy New York Times story appears, I'm unable to resist commenting on it in shorter pieces that are more typical of the blogging world. Now, the problem with my type of blog, of course, is that it doesn't appear on any regular or predictable basis, unlike Mando Weiss and Steve Walt, who I don't dream of going a day without reading. So it's difficult to gain a regular readership. But there is a terrific feature of blogging programs, including the program I use, which allows interested readers to sign up to be notified by email when a new blog appears, so they don't have to just check it. If something comes out that looks interesting, they'll get an email and decide whether they want to read it. So why do I blog on this particular issue? Over the course of my life, I've gone through 3 phases about Israel. Coming of age in New York City in the 1940s, immediately after the Holocaust, and with anti-Semitism still alive in America, I thought of myself as a fervent Zionist. I guess in a sense I still am something of a Zionist, although a lot less fervent, since I regarded the case for the creation of a Jewish state, if nothing else than as a refuge for persecuted Jews, as a compelling one. Because this immediately gets to the problem of where, and so I never thought of it as the case is not necessarily in a land that's already populated by others, obviously the Palestinians. So you have to separate those 2 components, difficult as it may be to do. Now, in light of the history of the Jewish people, perhaps this bedrock principle of Zionism, a refuge for Jews who really need a refuge, is still, if not compelling, at least not to be dismissed, understanding the long history involved. However much it has been betrayed, and betrayed is the right word as far as I'm concerned, by Israel. While still in my first phase as a fervent Zionist, at the end of the 1950s, I served as an anti-submarine warfare officer on a U.S. destroyer. And in the late 1950s, Egypt bought 4 subs from the Soviet Union. So I wrote to the Israeli embassy, and I volunteered to serve as an ASW officer on one of the Israeli destroyers in the event a new war broke out with Egypt before the Israelis could train their own people. But at the same time, my views began to change, and I entered into my second phase. Why? 3 things occurred. First, I began to read about, in a serious way, the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict as opposed to its mythology, which I, as almost everybody else, had accepted. Secondly, it soon became apparent that soon after the 1967 war, Gamal Abdel Nasser, before Sadat, was seeking to end the conflict, both of them, but they were being stonewalled. At that point, I felt like writing to Golda Meir and saying that if Israel blundered into an unnecessary war with Egypt, which of course it soon did, on me she should no longer depend. And third, at the same time, Foreign Affairs published George Ball's famous article, How to Save Israel in Spite of Herself, and it had a quite profound influence on me. These 3 factors impelled me into my second phase, the tough love phase, hoping that truth-telling would eventually convince the Israelis, and equally as important, probably the American Jewish community, that Israel was on the road to both a moral and security disaster and needed to come to terms with the historical truth as the first step, actually the sine qua non, of saving itself. But in the last few years, and this is quite hard to admit, let alone to say out loud, I no longer believe that tough love can work, and I no longer can say truly that I love Israel, as opposed, of course, to the many wonderful and courageous Israelis who still resist what their country has become. I no longer think Israel can be saved from itself, and it certainly cannot happen unless the American Jewish community itself, with its enormous influence on American policies, comes to grip with the true history of the conflict. So in short, Israel is no longer on the road to a moral and security disaster. It is already there, and I see no realistic prospect that it can reverse course. It is hard to see how a 2-state solution can be reached, and the 1-state solution, in quotes, to my mind, is no solution at all, but a fairy tale, which if somehow actually materialized could well be even worse than the present situation. Well, for me, that leads to the obvious question, so why bother to write about it? Well, part of the reason is illustrated by this story. One day, the governor was touring the state mental institution, and he came across a man who was completely naked, except that he had on a very elegant black top hat and beautiful black dress shoes. "Why do you run around naked?" the governor asked. "What's the difference?" the man responded. "Nobody ever comes to see me." "Then why the top hat and the dress shoes?" "Somebody might." In that spirit, I now write in the forlorn hope that truth and justice might yet prevail despite my deep pessimism. But equally, and maybe more so, I also now write in the spirit of not in my name. If you are a completely secular Jew, like me, it is hard to see what the point is of being Jewish, if not to uphold the best values of Western civilization. There was a time, there was a time when it was widely accepted, and not just by Jews, that the Jewish culture and tradition was one that was particularly committed to the best values of Western civilization: reason, truth, justice. Consequently, when Israel was founded and committed itself to be a light unto the nations, a few people sneered at that. No longer, needless to say, the appropriate response to what Israel has become is outrage, and so maybe that's the main reason why I continue to bang my head on this wall. Finally, is this activism or journalism, or both? I don't know. But as a lifelong academic, I prefer to think of it as scholarship in the best sense, the search for knowledge, reason, truth, and justice. Thank you.